The first talk I watched was by Seth Godin, and it essentially discussed the idea that the only ideas that succeed or the products that succeed in today's competitive market are ones that can actually spread. And I completely agree with this because the reason is if you have a product that isn't necessarily is necessarily really good, but you can't communicate that idea to other people, then nobody's actually going to want to buy into your product. That means in today's competitive market, there's no point in having a good idea if you can't communicate it to other people. It doesn't actually matter how good it is even if you see how good it is, if other people can't see that same thing, because the only products that succeed are ones that other people can see as good. He gives the example of sliced bread and how initially it actually failed because the company wasn't capable of marketing it as a really good product, even though now today we sort of use the phrase best thing since sliced bread, because now Wonder Bread and other companies that use sliced bread are capable of marketing it to a point where people will buy into that product. At that point, we see that the best thing that you can do to actually make your product succeed is communicate the idea in a way that other people will buy into it and believe that it is as good of a product as you claim it is. He goes on to talk about TV and mass media making it easy to spread ideas and the idea of the TV industrial complex, how people buy ads, they get more distribution, which allows them to sell more products and then buy more ads. So we see this endless cycle of marketing because we find that marketing is the number one way to get your product out, and products essentially succeed because people hear about them. It doesn't matter if you think your idea is good if other people don't think that your idea is good. Essentially, the only way that a product is going to succeed is if you can communicate it effectively and people actually buy into that. For example, he talks about promoting an oven mitt and how how companies spend $85 million essentially promoting just an oven mitt, because people will do anything to get customers to buy into their products, even if they believe that it's already amazing. That means that communication plays a huge role in any sort of business success. He goes on to talk about how now, because we have more choices, we have less time. That means that advertisers have to compete between one another and make their products unique. And the only way to communicate your product as unique is by separating it from all the other people. And the way that you do that is by marketing it in a way that you communicate the idea in a better way that other people are communicating their ideas, even if their idea may be better than yours. So now it's become less about who has the better idea and now more about who is better at communicating their idea. He defines the idea that your product is worth actually marketing about as remarkable, because the term itself means that it's worth talking about. It's something that's new, that's fresh, that's innovated. He explains that now essentially everyone is in the fashion and advertising business, because no matter what you're trying to advertise or no matter what your product is, you have to actually get it to people through advertising. He goes on to talk about how the big market is in the center and how we shouldn't be necessarily appealing to people on the extremes of the spectrum. So essentially we should be targeting the people that are listening. So communication is about finding your target audience and actually aiming all your products towards them, because the ones who are listening are the ones that are necessarily going to buy your product, because it's always easier to convince someone who's already sort of listening to your ideas to buy your product than to someone who's not even listening to your ideas to listen to your ideas and then buy your product. That means now, today, safety is essentially risky. You have to do things that you wouldn't ordinarily do in order to make sure that people are going to be willing to buy into your idea and actually buy your product. So those are my thoughts on the first talk that I watched. The second talk that I watched was by a man named Drew Dudley, who essentially talked about leadership and what it means to be a leader. He talks about how leadership is more than just about changing the world. It's about little actions that may have a bigger impact than we initially think. That it's more than just the butterfly effect, though. It has to do with very small actions, staying small, but mentally in the perspective of another person having a big impact. It's about making an impression on people without necessarily knowing that you did something that good. Because the biggest impact you can make may be something small, but to another person it may appear to be something even larger. That's why communication is a big deal, especially in the workplace. If you do things tiny, because small things you do can build you goodwill, and that can build up over a long period of time, resulting in something bigger than you had initially thought it was going to be. For example, if you were to sign your emails with something that cheerful or something professional yet happy, as opposed to just signing your name at the bottom, people notice small things like that. Those small things matter, and they build up to the point where you'd be more inclined to help someone who is always happy or always content in their emails with you, versus someone who is someone that you like to do business with but just signs their emails with their name and without actually engaging with you on a personal level. Essentially, people notice the little things you do to the point where it matters how you communicate with them. And if you're communicating with them in a way that they may not necessarily like, then there's going to be a really big impact on the way that that you interact with one another and the way that you're actually able to succeed as both a business and as a leader. So at that point, essentially, he gets across the idea that communication, regardless of who it's with, whether it's with a stranger or someone you already know, small things actually do matter. They build up and they can help you in the long term, and that's actually what makes a leader. It's someone who actually helps people without even knowing it, and someone who has an impact on the lives of other people, even if they don't necessarily have a huge position of power. That brings me to the third talk I watched from Simon Sinek, who essentially talks about how in the business world we sacrifice others so that we can gain for ourselves, whereas in the military we reward people for sacrificing their self so other people can gain. Then he talks about this idea of how the environment is what changes whether or not people will necessarily do heroic things, or with the capacity, or changes the capacity of people to do heroic things. I don't necessarily agree with this, because I think that there's some people that are just naturally born to do more heroic things than other people. There are people who are naturally born as leaders, whereas there are other people who won't necessarily, it's more difficult for them to come out of their comfort zone and become a leader. So sure, people can change, but sometimes it is just more natural for some people to become leaders and to do heroic things than other people. That's why I only agree to the extent that the environment has a portion of the only has a portion of the effect on whether or not people will do heroic things and help other people out. He goes on to talk about how the environment, such as the workplace, has to do a lot with trust and cooperation, because trust and cooperation is what guides our thinking. But the only way to achieve that sort of trust and cooperation is through essentially making an environment where we all feel safe and feel like a team, because we trust and want to cooperate with people when we feel safe. For example, the reason that we want to always work with our family and our best friends is because we feel safe with them, and we can now trust them because we know that they're not going to do anything intentional to harm us. Then he talks about how in the workplace, the environment has to be one conducive to teamwork, and I completely agree with that. That means that the way you communicate with your coworkers and your boss actually determines the success of your company, because the way to be successful is through teamwork, because you obviously can't build a business completely on your own. So the environment and the way you communicate with one another has to do a lot with how things are going to play out as far as a business goes, how your relationships are going to play out, how your public relationships are going to play out, and how you're going to be capable of selling your product or marketing your idea. So essentially, the conditions inside the organization are what matters as to determine the external factors, such as how much of a product you're capable of selling. He essentially talks about further how leaders are the ones that set the tone, because once the leaders decide to prioritize the workers, then can the results be a success. He gives the idea of how with Southwest Airlines, people feel comfortable buying their tickets and going on Southwest Airlines because the workers are comfortable in the position that they work. They feel like they're in a safe environment, so they're capable of making decisions on their own without fearing that they're going to be fired from their job from a leader for doing something that might assist a customer but necessarily cost them $5 or so, because they understand that in the long term, if they were to help that customer, Southwest Airlines in the future would be gaining a lot more money, because that customer would come back again and again. So essentially, this idea that dog-eat-dog organizations aren't safe is actually true, in that if you have an organization where people don't feel comfortable making decisions or communicating or working with one another, then there's no way you're going to actually have a successful society. So in the workplace, you can't be afraid to help others at your own risk in order to actually succeed for the majority of people. So he talks about how being a great leader is essentially like being a parent, because you want to provide opportunities, education, and discipline to your children while essentially introducing them to a higher plane of life, like Hawken would say. So one thing he also talks about is how you would never want to lay off a child for doing something that you may not necessarily agree with. At that point, the only way to create an environment where people feel comfortable working and making their own decisions, if you can have that sort of trust and communication between the authority and the workers themselves. So essentially, you want to treat them like family, so that there isn't that sort of risk where anyone feels like they can't make decisions on their own because they're afraid of being laid off. So essentially, communication is key to creating a safe environment and a successful environment. He gives one more example about how it's better that all of us suffer a little than anyone have to suffer a lot. He talks about how a company, instead of laying everybody off, demanded that everyone take 4 weeks of unpaid vacation days. So at that point, everybody takes a little bit of time where they're not paid, but that means that a bunch of people don't actually have to be laid off, and that essentially is beneficial and conducive to a family-like environment, to the point where some people decided to start taking 5 unpaid vacation weeks off so that others only had to take 3 because they might not necessarily be in the monetary situation where they can take 4 unpaid vacation weeks. So essentially, our natural reaction is to trust and cooperate with other people when the communication between one another is conducive to a family-like environment. And essentially, he talks about, finally, how leadership is a choice. It's not a rank, and there's a difference between authorities versus leaders, because there can be people on necessarily the bottom of a business ladder that can be the leaders in the environment, whereas they're helping other people sacrificing their own benefit to help other people, whereas there can be people at the top of the company who aren't necessarily leaders because they're willing to sacrifice other people for their own gain.